I'm Shiera Dikler. I am presenting research that I did as part of my master's thesis at Gorion University in the Department of Geography and Environmental Development. And I just published the thesis, and it's currently in the process of publishing a few articles to submit to journals, so hopefully you'll be able to see them soon. So let's get started. So we're all here because we know that the global food system has undergone a lot of changes in the last several decades that have related to the fossil energy, new technologies, shipping advancements, coupled with national food policies, market liberalization, and free trade agreements, which have all worked to increase the economic efficiency of the system, which has resulted in now we have countries have their imports and exports defining their food system as opposed to supplementing domestic production as it used to be. And consumers now have access to the highest variety of products than ever before in human history. But all of these advancements come at a significant cost. We have long commodity chains stretching across multiple regions of the world. Trade is primarily of processed foods as opposed to whole products as it used to be. And while we have worldwide spread of cuisines, the market is controlled by vertical integration, by instead of countries controlling the food system, it's controlled by institutions. And as a result, meat is the agricultural product now requiring the highest demand of land and water, as it's gone through significant expansion to meet the demands of consumers worldwide, and it's the most significant producer of greenhouse gas emissions. And Livestock's Long Shadow and the authors of the study have recently reported that 14.5% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions come from the livestock system. And red meat is found to have emitted 5 times more greenhouse gases than chicken or pork. So, in response to these issues, countries have begun measuring their global greenhouse gas emissions and resource use in response to all of these issues presented. And these studies typically only measure processes occurring within their own countries under the assumption that a country is only responsible for its production processes. But a growing number of studies now acknowledge that the contribution of a nation to global greenhouse gas emissions or resource use has to do with the processes occurring around the world that are designed to specifically provide for that country's consumption habits. So a small but growing number of studies are now acknowledging this idea by taking a multi-regional consumption perspective to evaluate a country's meat system. In the case of Israel, this idea is especially relevant as we do not have the climatic conditions or land or water resources available to have most of the meat system contained within our boundaries. So, like other countries that greatly depend on imports, we see the displacement of the meat system in Israel across the entire world. So, my study specifically looks at beef and chicken consumption in Israel. And looking at where all of these things are coming from, we see that most of the supply is 78% from local chicken production, which is 435,000 tons of chicken consumed every year. The rest is supplied by beef, which about 13% comes from an import from Latin America, Europe, and China. Calves are imported to Israel from Europe and Australia, which are finished in Israel and slaughtered here. And finally, in addition to domestic production of beef and chicken, 98% of the grain consumed in Israel for anything is imported, and a portion of this is used to support domestic production of meat. So in order to really understand what the contribution is of the local consumption system, it's important to look at the processes occurring in all of these regions of the world. So my study asks, what are the carbon, land, and water footprints of Israeli meat consumption? What factors influence the changing patterns of meat consumption and the resulting footprints over the last decade? And finally, what policy initiatives exist or should be proposed for reducing the global biophysical impact of Israeli meat consumption? So I took a multi-regional consumption perspective along the meat life cycle in my study, looking at the main greenhouse gases. The land footprint looked at pasture, cropland, and area needed for chicken coops. And the water footprint included green water, which is primarily precipitation, and blue water, which is primarily irrigation. My boundaries for production in Israel is cradle to processor gate, basically animal husbandry to slaughter, and for the rest of the world that Israel imports from, cradle to Israeli port, with the unit of analysis being 1 ton of boneless beef or chicken, and my study went from 1999 to 2010. I divided the system into 4 main categories and looked at processes contributing to the 3 types of footprints along each one. And the categories included the beef import, the calf import, local beef production, and local chicken production. And supplementary to this, I look at international shipping and the feed import. My main data sources include the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization Statistical Database, peer-reviewed academic articles, personal interviews with Israeli experts in the Ministry of Agriculture, the Israeli Dairy Council, and other private companies, and reports from international non-governmental organizations. Due to limitations in available data and uncertainties, because this is a very new field for being done around the world, and especially Israel, there were certain components to the system that couldn't be included at this time, but are recommended for future analysis, such as the other sources of meat consumption in Israel, such as sheep, goat, and pork, land use changes, resources needed in countries exporting calves to Israel, so I only looked at what happens once the calves leave their countries, and further stages of the life cycle after slaughter, such as local transportation and energy required for household cooking. So, taking a look at the results. This chart represents the carbon footprint of the system, divided into the 4 main categories of analysis along the 5 main stages of the life cycle, which include enteric fermentation, which is the methane emissions from the fermentation in the cow's gut, manure management, farm operations and feed production, processing, which is slaughter, and international shipping. So what we can see here is that the majority of the carbon footprint burden comes from the beef import with 73%, followed by domestic chicken production, and then domestic beef production, and the calf import. Something that's interesting to note here is that for all of the cow processes, especially the beef import, the main contributor to the carbon footprint is from the methane, from enteric fermentation and manure management. And looking at the chicken production, farm operations and processing are more than any of the other countries put together. And this has to do with the magnitude of the local chicken system, where over 220 million chickens are slaughtered every year for domestic consumption. Here are the results of the land footprint, where we see again that the beef import is the highest stakeholder of land resources, followed by domestic chicken production. And the beef import is really the only category here that has a significant use of pasture land, with domestic chicken production almost entirely using cropland. And as you see, it gets up to over 1 million hectares for the beef import. And finally, these are the results of the water footprint, where the differences between the categories aren't as severe as the previous footprints, but we also see that the beef import is the main contributor, with green water being the overwhelmingly largest resource in effect. So, looking at all of the footprints stacked up against the percentage of consumption from each of the sources, I looked at, these are the main regions of analysis: North America, Australia, China, Europe, Latin America, and Israel. And we can see from looking at the first chart, the first bar there of consumption, that 78% of consumption is from Israel. However, in all of the rest of the categories, it's really insignificant compared to the impact from all the other sources. And an issue with the data source for the water footprint doesn't allow disaggregation of the water used for imported grains. So it's actually not entirely accurate. So this area here should be divided among the other countries. But we also see that Latin America seems to have not as, maybe 10% of consumption, but really is overwhelmingly responsible for the greenhouse gases and land and water resources here. So we see that there's the hatama is not really accurate between them. So between years, I looked at a decade of time, there are certain variables that allow the results to change, and that has to do with which countries we're importing from, of the beef, calf, and feed, the type of shipping that we use for them. For example, up until recently, calves being shipped from Europe have come by plane, and now they're starting to come by ship, which has a decrease in the cost and a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll see in the coming years how this will impact the emissions from that source. Further, another variable is the composition of the feed, how much maize, how much wheat, how much leftovers from other industries are involved in the feed. The composition of the local energy mix, the more renewable energy we have in the energy mix in Israel, the less impactful the slaughtering processes are here. And finally, consumer habits. And this chart shows the changes in consumer habits from 1999 to 2010, where chickens have seen a really, really high growth since then, and also the calf import has gone from a small amount to more than doubled since 1999. So, with these results, I explored several policy directions and scenarios for how to play with the system to allow for more, to lessen the environmental impact and increase environmental efficiency. One of the directions was to manage the supply chain based on environmental standards. And for example, to increase the import from Europe instead of Latin America has the opportunity to decrease the land resources by 45%. And, I'm not a policy expert, but, the study touches on possible policy directions, and one of these could be imposing tariffs on imports from countries that have inefficient production practices. Another option is to encourage knowledge transferring from Israel to encourage more environmentally efficient practices in other countries. As the study found that increasing Israel production instead of the beef imports could decrease both the greenhouse gases and land resources by 35 to 45%.
Is that mainly driven by higher efficiency of production here, or by other costs like transport and so on?
It's mainly the efficiency of production here, but acknowledging that the system does not exist in a vacuum. There are consequences and implications among many other places, especially with the meat system. There's health ramifications and animal welfare. So this is a very specific result of looking at the scenarios between the data itself and not looking into what actually makes the most sense along all these spectrums. So the final direction was to explore options to change consumer habits. We found that replacing a portion of beef consumption with chicken reduces all footprints up to 40%. And finally, the scenario of meatless Mondays, each reduction of consumption by 1 day of meat in general reduces the footprints by 14%. And some policy directions for encouraging this would be to use eco-labels or have consumer campaigns for health and the environment, such as meatless Mondays. Great, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
So could you say a few words about why, like, I imagine in a free market there would be one country or region where it would be the cheapest, let's say, to produce cars, and then all the import would come from that place, and you say that it's more or less evenly distributed. Could you say why? Like why prefer, if you say, is there a reason why to import cows from South America and not from Europe, assuming that we import from both?
Sure. There are a lot of different variables involved. For example, in Latin America, the cows are raised for a longer amount of time, so they're emitting more methane over their lifespan. The type of diet that they eat is more methane emissions per year, so that is also adding to it. They are being raised on pasture land, which is a larger amount of land used per animal. So the results found, if we were to import from Europe, it reduces all of those components. However, it's also encouraging factory farming, which has other implications.
And currently, for someone who imports cows, why is it the same price?
Oh, for importing the cows?
Yeah.
He's asking why there's a distribution from several places instead of one place. How did that market become such that there is a distribution of imports from different various places?
The same price shouldn't be the same.
I can't give a specific answer, but I can guess that it has to do with the producers in Israel looking for the cheapest places and the quality of the meat, and so it's really stretched the market out to any meat possible.
But from Latin America, it's also a frozen beef.
Yes.
It's not raw.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
I wanted to ask you, you said in the last that replacing a portion of the beef with chicken can reduce by 40%, right?
Yeah, I said that if we were to reduce 50% of consumption of beef and replace that with chicken, that's what it would be. 50%.
But the 14% is for everything, including the chicken.
Yes.
For every day.
I mean, but that's a simple mathematical thing because it's reducing by a seventh, which is about 14%.
Yeah.
So any reduction in overall meat is going to reduce any of the implications by 14%. Yeah.
You said that producing beef in Israel was more efficient than producing it in the places that we import it from. What are the causes? What are the differences in the practices that lead to the difference in efficiency?
The majority of the cattle raised in Israel is in feedlots, and the fattening processes allow them to be slaughtered at a much younger age than in other countries. In Europe, the feed is divided between pasturing and supplemental feed, so it takes longer, and they're slaughtered at a later age. So that's one of the main things that differentiates the local system.
In one of the last slides, you show an increase in the consumption of chicken, and it seems like there's an overall increase in the consumption of all kind of meat together. Is it true that the population consumes more meat now?
Oh, the per capita consumption has increased as well as you can explain it's not enough that just the population's increased, so the consumption's increased. The per capita consumption has also increased.
So the increase is
2010, yes?
The increase is bigger than the increase in the population.
Sorry?
The increase is bigger than the increase in the population.
Yes. It's interesting that looking at the four different sources, the local system for beef production has stayed relatively constant over the last decade, meaning that all of the being able to supply for the demand, the local demand, has come from an increase in the calf import and the frozen beef.
Was the increase in consumption correlated with the drop in price, or was it just change of habits?
I do not know. I did not do an economic analysis of the prices over the years.
It's not cheaper, I can tell you.
Yeah.
Did you treat water footprint in Israel as equal to water footprint abroad? And the second question is, did you sum it up? What?
Can you?
Did you treat if there's a water footprint in Israel, is the impact the same as a water footprint in Latin America in your analysis? If 10 liters are wasted in Israel, is it the same as it's?
Oh, yes.
If it's wasted in...
I did not add any weighted factors.
So it's all aggregated as if...
It's all aggregated,
Okay.
but also, as I said earlier, the data source for the water footprint acknowledges that the majority, that for countries that have a significant import of grain used to feed the cows, then the water footprint should ideally be distributed among those countries, taking the perspective of my research. But because of the limitations to that study, it just aggregates it all under Israel.
Okay, and that's the second question, which you partially answered. In your footprint, you also look at the whole value chain of everything that's needed to feed the animals, not just watering them or chilling them. Also the water needed for the grain.
Oh, yes.
Okay.